Good evening, everyone. My name's Conrad Moore, and I am a core trainer with Roots of Justice. And that song that Marvin Gaye, that we were playing, Marvin Gaye, he could have written that song yesterday, and we would still be trying to answer the question, what's going on? I am here with 4 professors tonight: Professor Ruth Naomi Floyd, Professor Jennifer Graber, Professor Felipe Hinojosa, and Professor Tobin Miller Shearer. And we are going to be taking a deep dive, as deep as we can go in an hour, a deep dive into our history to take a glance at where we are and see if this is a spot where we've been before as a nation, what's changed, what hasn't, and why. So, Professor Ruth,
yes,
would you introduce yourself and tell everybody what you're passionate about and why?
sure. It's good to see everyone this evening, and thank you, Conrad, for the kind invitation to come and listen and share. I'm an emancipatory artist. I'm a vocalist and composer and an educator. I also am a fine art photographer. I have a discography that is dedicated to sacred jazz and then also to history in the form of my latest body of work, the Frederick Douglass Jazz Works, where we take the life, the words, speeches, and reflections of the iconic Frederick Douglass and put them to jazz improvisational music. I'm also a grassroots worker in justice. I've been involved in HIV AIDS work for over 25 years, going really close to 30. And I've also worked in trans areas. So I'm a justice worker, and I love that. I am passionate about truth telling. I feel like I know that I believe that each generation has the task of talking about and sharing about and creating around what's gone before us to also push us into the future. And so I'm very interested in truth telling. And then also, I'm a seeker of beauty, that in the darkest hours in this country and around the world, there is beauty and it surrounds us. You just have to look for it. So.
Well, I am so glad to see you, Dr. Ruth. I am, last time I saw you was in the training in Philadelphia. I cannot tell you how glad I was to have you in the room. I was, yeah.
That was rough. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it
You
was.
were marvelous.
Yeah,
You were marvelous. I hope you read the responses. Your name was high among them. It's someone who spoke the truth with love and peace, but pointedness. And so a lot of in the room were able to hear you because of that. So thank you for the profound work you do and how you do it and how you deliver it.
thank you so much. Professor Felipe.
Conrad, first of all, thank you for having me on here. And, hey, man, it's been way too long since we've worked together.
Yeah.
And so it's just really great to see you and to hear your voice and to engage and interact with you again. And with all of the panelists that are on here today. I am an associate professor in the history department at Texas A&M University. I'm going on my 11th year teaching here at
Wow.
Texas A&M. Yeah, I know, right?
Wow.
And and I've been doing and involved in one way or another with anti-racism work and education for over 20 years now. It's something that as a very young man, I became not only interested in out of my own experiences, but also wanting to participate in the learning process and participate with other communities and to talk about, my own home community. I was born and raised in Brownsville, Texas, on the U.S.-Mexico border. My family's still there. And so all of those things that I learned growing up, I brought into my work, and I continue to involve that in everything that I do. I see myself primarily as a storyteller and as someone that, in terms of writing history and doing this work that I do, I love and I'm attracted to stories that, can help us gain a deeper understanding of ourselves and our communities and our relationships to other people. So I'm honored to be here tonight. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Professor. Professor Jennifer Graber.
Hello, Conrad, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here and for all of you that joined us. I live in Austin, Texas, where I'm a historian in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. I started my career as a historian of prisons, which meant that I was reading about and learning about stories in which forms of criminal justice are used usually on whatever underclass is present and in a given time period. So I've written about the way that immigrants have been subjected to criminal justice, but then increasingly throughout American history, the way that folks who are racialized as Black are specifically targeted in that system. One thing that came out of that was also a discovery about the use of incarceration against Native Americans, and have moved in my historical work toward looking at Native American histories, including the ways that churches have worked with government to try to acculturate and really kind of forcefully acculturate Native people. These things that for me are really tied together, the way that disciplinary institutions and racial minorities, their histories are intertwined. And I feel also this kind of practical, that even though this is my academic career, I have this like practical interest as well, and have done a lot of prison visitation in my life, and am working right now to bring a little more justice to Austin. So.
Wow. Thank you so much, Professor. Professor Tobin.
Conrad, it is such a delight to be in a room with you and with my colleagues here. Anytime Conrad's going to ask me to do anything, I'm going to do everything I can to be there. I've been working with Conrad and Felipe and others I've been at it for about 30 years. Felipe, thank you for the reminder that it's been even longer than you have. Conrad was reminding me about how much older I look, so I appreciate that as well. I'm a history professor at the University of Montana. I also direct the African American Studies program here in Missoula. Been doing that for 12 years. The thing I am probably most passionate about, that I have a deepest sense of calling, is working with other white people on issues of racism and white privilege and whiteness and white power. I've done a lot of writing on that, done a lot of writing about Anabaptist history, the white church engagement with the African American community in a variety of forums. Continue to do that. Love working with students and walking alongside white folk as they discover ways to resist our participation in institutional and systemic racism in all its many forms. So absolutely delighted to be here among such an august crew. Thanks, Conrad.
Well, and you all have, excuse me, we'll give you an opportunity to talk about your published works at some point. And Professor Hinojosa, you have an upcoming publication. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
You want to tell us about it? We can do that now.
All right. I just finished writing a book on 1969 and 1970 occupations of churches and church institutions by Puerto Rican and Chicano activist groups. And it was an extension, but not totally related, to James Forman's Black Manifesto, which some of you might know about and remember. This is Forman's call for reparations from the white church to pay $500 million in reparations for the money that it really benefited from and gained from with the enslavement of African people. And so out of that, the book that I wrote about sort of documents activist Latino radical politics in these communities, not so much in terms of reparations, but in terms of pushing back against urban renewal in 4 major cities: Chicago, LA, New York, and Houston. And that's coming out January 2021, University of Texas Press. So, right in time for Christmas. So, I better see y'all buy some of that.
Oh yeah. Hey, make sure you send me a couple of autographed copies.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I have a 9-year-old who's going to be 10 in a few days, and I was I was so gratified last Christmas when and I wasn't even around for this to happen, but when my wife was asking her what did she want for Christmas, among the things that she asked for was some history books. I was really happy to hear that, because I think in our house it's been very clear that that history is important. Knowing, knowing your history, knowing the histories of other people's, and not just the history, but various versions of historic events so that you could get a clearer picture of what actually happened. I believe that our students get romantic stories. And I'm very concerned about that, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to gather us here tonight. I have a clip that I'm going to show, that Brenda is going to show. It is Attorney General William Barr. And it's something that he said about a week or so ago about history.
Doing the law's bidding.
You know you're going to take a lot of incoming, as they say in the military, for this decision.
I'm prepared for that, but I also think it's sad that nowadays these partisan feelings are so strong that people have lost any sense of justice.
Flynn welcomed the news with a tweet of his grandson, and former FBI Director Jim Comey, who started the investigation into the president, voiced his displeasure on Twitter, saying the department had lost its way.
When history looks back on this decision, how do you think it will be written?
Well, history's written by the winner, so it largely depends on who's writing the history.
Ruth, Professor Ruth, what would you say to Attorney General Barr if you had an opportunity to speak to him about that particular comment?
I would say history is told by those who have been present, and who have endured it. So if you're saying that history is told by the winners, you look at the enslaved the African prisoners of the forced labor system of American slavery, you look at their narratives, you look and hear what they said, you listen to their songs. Ultimately, they were winners, but in their songs and in their narratives is the truth. And and so to me, the Department of Justice hasn't lost its way. It's still trying to find its way towards justice. So I think we have to define what are winners, what are survivors, who are those that endure. So I would encourage him to look at all of history, and certainly look at history of the Black and Brown, who were not allowed to tell their story, were not allowed to have their story told in public, have them published, to speak truth to power. So for certain communities, sure, but not for others.
So, Professor Tobin, as a white historian, what did it sound like? When I look at his face when he says that, I see all of this smugness that basically sets my hair on fire. If I had hair, it would be on fire. But Professor Tobin, as a white historian, what is Barr saying to you? And as a writer also?
Well, I think he makes the assumption that his white audience will agree with his sense that the white community has the right to tell the narrative, has the right to craft the narrative, has the right to present a story that only gives a perspective from the white gaze. I am glad that there are white people who are learning to push back against that narrative. One of the most exciting moments I have in an intro course I do where we visit the civil rights movement is to present the narrative arc of the civil rights movement story as it's usually told in our sort of national celebration, but ask them to re-examine it, to cast aside the sense of Martin Luther King being the only leader that can make things happen. So what we look for a charismatic leader, and if that charismatic leader isn't there, then we don't have a movement. And that couldn't be any less true. And ask them to begin to examine not only the unacknowledged African-American leaders, which is, I think, the place we always have to start. So we're bringing in the voices of Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker and Bayard Rustin and so many others, but then also to acknowledge that there were white folks who were co-strugglers within that didn't buy the narrative, that didn't have that smug history, and were co-strugglers along the way. And I want them to know that full story so that we can push back against the assumption that all white people are going to buy into that history, which ends up just perpetuating this culture and all its racist manifestations.
Mm-hmm. Professor Jennifer, would you like to weigh in on that?
Yeah, when I first heard him say that history is written by the winners, in some ways that's true, insofar as high school textbooks for US history class have reflected pretty conservative outlooks and very kind of nationalistic and really exclusionary outlooks over time. One exercise I do with my students is that we look at US history textbooks as they've been published over the last century, over the 20th century. And we literally count like how many pages, different groups of people, different regions, men versus women, different kinds of issues. Like we look to see kind of who's covered, but we also look to see what kind of stories being told.
Mm-hmm.
So in one sense, I think he's right. Like a lot of our textbooks tell a narrative that is still fairly exclusionary, or even if it is more inclusive, it is not about equity. It is certainly not about acknowledging pain, acknowledging injustice, and working toward overturning that. But I'm totally with Ruth in saying that one of the jobs of historians is to go out there and continually overturn that sort of history written by the winners. Like we go out and we find all kinds of sources. She was talking about spirituals. One thing I've used is Native American drawings when there's a society without an alphabet yet. We can get creative and go out there and find those materials and then bring those voices in and write a different narrative.
Is he speaking about, in a sly way, it sounds like he's talking about control, not just who's writing the history, but having the power to decide whose writings are going to get into our schools.
Mm-hmm. As someone who has testified before the Texas State Board of Education, he's right. They are gatekeepers, and they're not interested often in what historians who want to overturn that narrative, what we're doing.
So, Felipe, you are in Texas, and you are teaching at a Texas university. Did you go to high school in Texas, Professor Hinojosa?
Yeah, I did. And I mean, I agree with what Jennifer has just stated. I think to a certain extent, he's right. I also think that the winners of this history have had a rough go of it the last 50 years or even longer, as folks that have written these counter narratives have pushed back and challenged against this. I think the everything that we see going on now, whether we're talking about the removal of statues, we've got a big controversy on my campus at Texas A&M with a Confederate statue right here. But all of that, I think of, the iconic sort of Texas historians like Walter Prescott Webb that wrote the big book on the Texas Rangers, this, group of state-sanctioned law enforcement officers that were vigilantes that were out to kill Native folks, indigenous Mexican folks, African Americans here in the state of Texas. And the book that he writes commemorating what the Texas Rangers did has stuck with that sort of mythic and folkloric history that is and represents Texas. in the midst of that storyline is Americo Paredes, an anthropologist out of the University of Texas that in the 1950s writes a book called With His Pistol in His Hand, and basically pushes back against that narrative of the Texas Rangers, and begins to sort of develop this resistance history, and really sort of launches and begins to sort of launch this field of Mexican-American history here in the state of Texas. We're still dealing with that. And the amazing work that people like Paredes, Marta Cotera, and others that have sort of paved the way for how we think about pushing back against these winners. That's the literature that we go to try to dismantle these truths that the supposed winners were out to do. Colonialism doesn't stop at the end, or when the troops leave, or when the killing, quote unquote, stops, or whatever it is. It continues in those textbooks.
Yeah. There's a high school textbook that I used to use in the anti-racism trainings, and I would try to show people the weirdness, but they still speak of the period from the 1400s to the 1700s as the age of discovery. I mean, it's really in very romantic terms. We're going to show another clip real quick about Confederate monuments, as a matter of fact. If Brenda would cue that up. Brenda's our technical support.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I have a new update here, and this one actually has to do with an announcement that Mayor Stoney just made. Mayor Stoney has basically come out and said he's looking to remove all of our Confederate monuments. You know, I've spoken advocately against erasing Virginia's history. This does not belong to Mayor Stoney. It belongs to all Virginians. It is our history. Do I think we should learn from it? Absolutely. And we should add to the monuments that are there. But you know, it disturbs me whenever I see people, you know, let's be honest here. There is an overt effort here to erase all white history. I mean, that's what they're looking at doing.
Okay. So Brenda might shoot me a text in a minute because I can't remember that politician's name, but she is a state senator in Virginia, and she's in Richmond, and she's talking about how they are removing Confederate statues in an attempt to erase white history. Her name was Amanda Chase. Thank you, Brenda. Her name was Amanda Chase. So erase white history. What's happening? What's happening there? What's happening there? Please, somebody interpret. I need an interpreter.
I speak white people pretty well, and I'll try to do an interpretation here. But she is doing the fundamental move that protectors of the Confederacy legacy always make, and that is to confuse and conflate the idea of valorizing racist individuals with protecting history. Any monument, all those monuments, Confederate monuments, were put up after the Civil War as part of the lost cause narrative and an attempt to reframe what happened in the Civil War, to paint that past as something other than the protection of the enslavement of human beings. And those monuments have never been about history. They've been simply about the valorization of racist individuals. And we have to be clear about the distinction and call it out for what it is, so that we can have a conversation about what actually happened. That's based on archival sources, that's based on the testimonies of those who experienced it, and is not simply a recapitulation of the lost cause narrative that she seems to have bought into entirely.
So why does she use the language of erasing history? Professor Ruth, why do you think she uses the language of erasing white history?
I mean, I think there needs to be a clarification like Tobin said, where it's the erasure of hateful imagery. It's the erasure of statues that tell a false history. So you know what's going on with the Emancipation statue in DC.
Okay.
And this is really great to know. This is what Frederick Douglass had to say. And he was present when it was unveiled, and he gave an iconic speech. And this is what he said. Truth compels me to admit, even here in the presence of the monument we have erected to this memory, Abraham Lincoln was not, in the fullest sense of the word, either our man or our model. In his interest, in his associations, in his habits of thought, and in his prejudices, he was a white man. And so Douglass was enraged when he saw that statue, when it was unveiled. And the newly free-ish slave was in gratitude at the feet of Lincoln. And what he says is true. There was a middle school lesson plan for history. It was either Alabama or Mississippi. And they published it on Twitter. And it was about Jefferson Davis. In the history lesson, it did not mention the Civil War. It did not mention slavery. It did mention Confederacy. And at the end, the students had to write an essay of what elements you could take away from Jefferson Davis's valor, courage, all these things. We are still, we are still plagued with false narratives. So for me, it's like, it seems that there's more emphasis put on protecting these racist structures instead of loving your neighbor, instead of being concerned what they mean to each of us, what it represents in the history. But it's entrenched in white supremacy, and it's also aligned with their nationalism, and with, in a lot of cases, their version of Christianity and patriotism. So when you come for them and for their statues, they feel it's personal. You can hear in her voice that she's very upset, that she's brokenhearted about this. So it's not just the history, but it's also who she views, how she views herself, in the sense of that convergence of nationalism, in some cases Christianity, and a false narrative.
Wow. I'm going to give each of you an opportunity to speak to this particular thing, because as a parent, I am deeply concerned, because what our children learn is dependent literally on where they are, not just what school they're in, but what state they're in. So if you could speak to the parents who might be listening and watching, what are we to do as parents? How are we to meddle? Because I see my role as a meddler. I meddle in my daughter's education, because I want to, because I think it's important. So, and I think parents should be meddlers. How can we best do that? Because this is my first time living in the Deep South. I'm in Georgia right now. Right now I'm in Marietta, Georgia. I'm from Philadelphia. And I recognize that I got a very different history in school in Philadelphia than they get here in Georgia. So now I have a elementary schooler who is in school in Georgia. And so I find myself battling with her civics lessons and her teachers. So speak to the parents and give us some instructions. I mean, what do we do?
You meddle, you get in, you engage, your students, you don't, or your kids, you don't run away from difficult, conversations. And these are things that, I'm raising my kids in a very conservative part of Texas. And I, I did not grow up in a part of Texas that is as conservative as this is. And so we are constantly having discussions around politics, around what they're learning at school. And it's not so much in a way to sort of deprogram whatever they're getting there. It's in a way to raise questions for them. They're developing their own ideas. They're developing and learning and engaging, with their friends and with the school system and all of that. And it's my job to make sure, I see my job as a parent to make sure that when they leave the house, they're going to know exactly what it is that we believe. And if I can, do that, then I feel like I've done what I've needed to do. I don't put a lot of pressure on teachers either. I'm very, I know that they sometimes might see me and roll their eyes when I'm coming down to say hello, but I know they're part of a larger system here that limits what it is that they can or can't do. There are a lot of fabulous teachers out there that are working extremely, extremely hard to give different narratives and tell different stories about our history. And a lot of really great folks that are working to try to do that. And so it's always an engagement too with the teachers and with what my kids are learning and what they're reading in their textbooks. But we certainly we got to get away from this whole notion of you don't talk politics or religion or whatever it is, at the dinner table or just sitting around the living room. We have to teach our kids how to have these conversations, because if we don't, they're going to stumble through life not knowing what it is that they believe or know.
Yeah. When I have my daughter reading things that are not part of her school curriculum, my instructions to her are, I don't want her to memorize things. I want her to read what the little parts that I've given her, because she was in 4th grade last year, but she's at a 6th grade reading level, so she's pretty good. But I want to know what questions it's raised for her. I want her to begin to think critically. What questions do you come away with after you read that? And she actually comes away with some pretty good questions. How else do we meddle? Go ahead, Dr. Jennifer, you're up.
So I think that Felipe is exactly right, that you figure out what your children are being taught. And I think actually one place that can often slip by are the state history curricula. Because those can often be even more old-fashioned than the national, like US history. So in Texas, my kids were in 4th grade and 7th grade at the same time. And those are both years you take a year-long course in Texas history. And it was remarkable. And I'm also with Felipe in saying that it's really not your individual classroom teacher's fault, right? Like they have to meet certain standards and teach kids certain ideas that I, as a historian, find, and really a person who believes in justice and truth, I find objectionable. So one thing that we've done is I drag my kids to every kind of crazy museum, whether it's a big, huge museum or some like little museum by the highway. And one thing I ask, especially my daughter, who's curious about these things, is like, at the end, what would you change? Like, what is missing? Who else's story could be there? What would you add? What would you subtract? What's, giving her an idea, if she could create a museum on this topic, what would it have in it? And that's a similar question you can actually ask about a book, a history book of any kind. But when you do it about museums, it can be this very practical way to say like, oh, there were no people like this, or this time period got totally skipped, or this huge event got totally skipped. Like I would add this. So that's kind of one practical way we do it as we road trip around Texas and other places.
That's helpful. Dr. Tobin.
So we have 2 sons. Our younger son for a while was into stand-up comedy. And the last piece he did before he left Missoula to move to Chicago was an extended riff on growing up as the son of a white anti-racist guy, which all of the gags were at my expense, but it also told the story of how we tried to make conversations about race natural, normal, and frequent in our household. So everything from exploring and interrogating the association of blackness and negativity in the Harry Potter series, to talking about a drawing they brought home from kindergarten that had I for Indian, and how we then sat down as a family to develop a strategy about how we were going to talk to the teacher about no longer doing that. And we were successful in that. So one of the great joys of my life is having my sons now push me if they think I'm not adequate in my response to a situation of racism. And they have done so many times, and it's incredibly gratifying to see the investment of our time of making this natural, normal, and frequent around our supper table, around the TV, when we're going camping. It was just part of what we did. And obviously at the time, they didn't always enjoy it, and they make jokes about it, but it seems to have found a home.
Excellent. I am gratified these days. I have a granddaughter who is she's a Roots of Justice apprentice, and I had the honor of doing an anti-racism training with my granddaughter as a right. That was just so gratifying. I can't tell you how much that did for my heart. Go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to say for our children, we taught them to rub against history and
Yes.
to also look forward and see what lessons learned, and to see if there was a vicious cycle that continued, so that they would look forward. When I was in high school, I went to a high school that had a great history, department, and I finally got to 11th grade. I was so excited for American history, and it was like a 600-page book, and I think 15 pages of it was on the Native Americans and maybe 25 on American slavery. And then there were 75 or maybe 175 pages on the Holocaust, which isn't American history. I mean, we brought it to the war, and all these other things. So I went to the teacher who had his copy of his Harvard diploma on the wall. And I was like, this isn't part. I went on, and I never forget. He turned around and he goes, "Oh, I just never noticed." I was just like, this is crazy. So like Jennifer, having her watch, documentaries, saying what's wrong with this, what's right, life lessons. And then of course, like museums, like you, Jennifer, just taking them where there's history and helping both children understand that history is active and that it's alive. And I love the fact that, the first place that people go to know about a civilization is through the arts. And so
yes,
even that the artistic voice is usually the prophetic voice that speaks about what's going on and at the times and the struggles and the conflicts. So it's really, really powerful to do that. Yeah.
So what about the people, Professor Ruth, what about the people who want to maintain these Confederate icons because they are art?
I think there's a place for them, or a place can be created for them. I think we look through it through an artistic vein, then we can put them in places where they can be viewed in context of history and in context of the art. The statues are very well made. They're beautiful, but they,
not all of them.
Right, yeah. Yeah, you're right. I mean, the craftsmanship is there, beautiful aesthetically, like in the craft and the skill, most of them, but you're right, not all.
But there's one of Nathan Bedford Forrest on I-65. I'm a truck driver, so I pass these all the time. It's on I-65. It is really grotesque. The sculptor who made it, and it's huge, but the sculptor was just clearly not good at what he did, and it is a grotesque sculpture. But it actually should be. That actually feels like it's right. That it is a grotesque. But I'm sorry I interrupted you. But go ahead, Dr. Ruth.
No, go ahead. No. I mean, I think there are places where there can be for artistic purposes and history. But they shouldn't be, I think, in the public where you have to walk by them. There are 3 statues I have to walk by. One was actually in UK, so I was glad to see it go into the river in Bristol. But you know, it's just it's another level of dehumanization. It's another level of glorifying hate. It's another way of embracing white supremacy, and it's another way saying that we are still not equal. And it's, most importantly, it's glorifying a false narrative that isn't, you know, tell the truth. History has enough tension within it, and in a sense, it almost has a beautiful, in a lot of cases, not all, obviously, a sense of redemptive beauty. And so when you don't tell the truth, you lose the opportunity sometimes historically to talk about the redemptive beauty. So if you tell the truth about, you know, for instance, Jefferson Davis, or you tell the truth about that statue with Lincoln and the humble, grateful slave. If you tell the truth about that, that there were those that pushed themselves, that fought to be free, that their definition of free is not always on the floor at the feet, humbly saying, "Thank you, Master. Thank you, sir." You know, if you tell the stories, they're beautiful, redemptive stories. You lose that gift of teaching what redemption looks like and the beauty in it when you tell that false narrative. You know?
Yeah, thank you. The my observation is that white people just don't know their history, and I think in a lot of ways they kind of don't want to, because much of it is unpleasant. Much of it is unpleasant. So there's this need they have to feed our children a course of romantic stories with a few names and a few dates to memorize, and that process masquerades as teaching history. I had a altercation, well, not an altercation actually, but a conversation with one of my daughter's teachers, because I was having a conversation with an indigenous friend, and after I got off the phone, my daughter asked me, was that person that I was talking to, were they an Indian? I said, well, yeah, and she said, well, I thought all the Indians were dead. And so I'm trying to figure out where she got that, of course, because we never told her that in our house. So I looked at some of her assignments, and what I noticed was that a teacher had given them an assignment, and all of the wording was past tense. You know, what did the natives do here? How did they eat? How did they live? How did they collect their food? You know, all past tense. So I had to go in and speak with the teacher that she needed to pay closer attention to how she phrased her questions, because there's, in all of this teaching, there is unspoken communication, but communication nevertheless, even though it's unspoken, you're still communicating to the children, even in the way that you phrase the questions. She heard me, and we parted amicably, but she did get the point that she needed to rephrase these questions, because you're sending children away from here with an idea that's actually not so.
And that idea gets confirmed, Conrad, once they get to the college level and they take the second half of U.S. history, and there's almost no engagement with Native Americans, and the power movement, or during the civil rights era, and the engagement with multiple groups. It's jarring to see. And when you get students sort of talking about it, they're blown away. But it's because of that narrative that they get, that somehow Native folk just disappeared, you know, after the Civil War, or by the 20th century, folks were gone. And you know, that's not the case.
Yeah, it's and I think that idea is pervasive. I mean, it's that pattern of miseducation. I think it happens everywhere. We had it in Pennsylvania, and we have it in Georgia. We have a few minutes left. I want you to get an opportunity to say something about your books. Also, is there something that you think the audience needs to hear, but I didn't have enough sense to ask you that question? This is the time. This is the time for that.
Well, let me just add too that I think we all value and see our work as critically important. And I think everyone would agree that we need more people doing this work, more folks to do this kind of history. And it's no coincidence that, you have the arts and humanities that are being cut. We're the first programs that often get cut. History majors especially have seen a decline across the board, because there is no sense that students, when they sign up to be a history major, that they can get a job or if they can do something beyond just teaching. And so I think part of it is, everybody's hustling to do this work to move against these sort of master narratives of these winners, as we talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also a political side to it, because history is dangerous. When you get your hands on it and when you start to learn it, I know that for me, it was a 180. Academically. It turned me into a nerd. I wanted to read books. I wanted to know more, because it set me on fire. And I think that part of that work that we do then has to be translated into making sure that our programs are well funded and that there are opportunities for graduate students after they leave here. Not just maybe they don't want to go into academia, but in the museums or in different public historians and in other different spaces. I don't know what that looks like, but it just feels like it needs to be something that has to be said, because I wish there were more people signing up to be history majors. And on the other end, I understand when folks say, I don't know if I want to do that. What kind of job am I going to get? I don't want to be a teacher, so anyway.
I had a middle school teacher who literally turned me into a history nerd. I was in ninth grade, and he's one of the few teachers whose names I remember. And I don't know what he did differently to teach history, but what I do know is he literally turned me into a history nerd. And I found myself getting angry as an adult at the things that I was learning that I feel like I should have learned in grade school or in high school. And I was angry that somebody decided for me that those were things that I didn't need to know. Okay, for the rest of you guys, we still have a few minutes left. Is there something that I did not ask you, but you'd like the audience to know?
A couple of things I've been noticing about the way in which we are approaching history. I think we're getting a good grasp of approaching history for inspiration. I think we're getting a good grasp of how to look at history for cautionary tales of things we don't want to repeat. I'm not seeing us spend as much attention to looking at history for the strategies we can use and bring forward that have been successful in the past. Quick example, civil rights movement. One of the things that the leaders of groups like the SCLC and SNCC and many of the others, CORE, that were working in the South did was recognize the fault lines of the white segregationists and use that against them. It was a brilliant, both rhetorical and strategical move. We need to be replicating those very thoughtful kind of strategical patterns in our current work to address systemic racism now. That's another way we can use the tools of history, not just for inspiration, not just as cautionary tales, but also as a strategy book to move forward, given that there are different complexities, but there's some great strategies that are too often ignored in our present moment.
That was helpful.
One thing I think about is how we could give people agency in creating alternative forms of valorization, right? If we're going to take these Confederate statues down, which we should, because they are forms of valorization. I don't teach history by showing my students statues. No historian does that. Statue creation is part of history. So if we pull those down, we can then ask, who do we actually valorize, right? Whose monument should we put here? And one of the things that happened at a local elementary school, which is named after Robert E. Lee here in Austin, there was this long community process, and they actually renamed the school for an African-American artist from here in Austin, whose last name was also Lee, but now his first name is attached to the school. And it's really been an interesting thing because I think people were a little more open to it, but basically they had this community conversation about, who is it that we want to lift up? And I think that makes people feel agency and makes them realize that it is about honoring and respecting. It's not simply, oh, that is history. No, this is where we decide as a society what we value, who we want to emulate. And, so that was a really interesting process to watch, but they renamed it after a Black artist after lots of arguing.
Well, and I could tell that made you feel good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One tiny, beautiful step.
Yeah. I like that.
And that is redemptive beauty. That is redemptive beauty, and it's beautiful. For me, I mean, the arts, same thing, selected historical amnesia. You have, especially in classical music, the elitism, so helping, you might hear firecrackers. That's the way my neighborhood is protesting at 9 o'clock. They put out firecrackers. So you might hear a boom. So I'll hurry up before the next one goes off. But and then also even courses like the history of pop. I'm director of jazz studies at Cairn University and an adjunct and artist in residence at Temple University. And looking at jazz history, the lack of historical truths, even within that music that was created, that was under such oppression. The history of that has been sanitized or actually erased and whitenized. So you have Elvis as the king of rock and roll. And you're like, Jelly Roll, like, what's going on? You can't, there's a sense of erasing Black and brown people who created it at a high cost. I don't see that when I go to the UK for concerts and things. I don't see that. They know the history better than we do. So even within the arts, there's still that false narrative and erasure of Black and brown communities who created this music. And then certainly in Christianity, their history is extremely, extremely, and that's where I think you really get most of the fight, right? To tell the truth about America and its history of Christianity, and to say that they changed the catechism, they changed the theology, they changed it to oppress. So what am I saying? They use theology to weaponize Black and brown bodies so that they could continue to oppress them. Or when that didn't happen, when they were usually caught or called on, then they would hide behind theology to continue to oppress. And so I think that's another area where the history is talk about it's just absolutely lies. It's not even a false narrative. It's just lies. So those two areas too.
We are going to do another panel discussion, and we are going to talk specifically about the history of the church as it relates to the world and identity development, what role the church played in shaping the identities of everybody on earth when the church had that kind of power, because it did play a role in shaping everybody's or I should say missshaping identities. And so we're going to do another panel discussion. If we could get you to come back, Professor Ruth, that would be great. And I'd like to invite my other busy panelists to come back for that one as well, because I am absolutely certain that y'all would have some thoughts on that. But I don't want to, make you commit to anything right now. But at least
we got a couple things to say.
Yeah, no doubt.
Hey, let me, because I know the moderator wanted us to vocalize or to say the books. I'm just gonna name for resources out there. Monica Martinez's book, The Injustice Never Leaves You, get into the state-sanctioned violence of the Texas Rangers against the Mexican population in Texas. It's an excellent book. The other one's brand new too. Joana Fernandez's The Young Lords of Radical History. I think in the moment of thinking about coalition building between Latinx and Black communities, the Young Lords represented that sort of revolutionary nationalism that is so important. So anyway, I'll just throw those out there. I think everybody should be reading those books.
And your book also, Dr. Hinojosa.
Yes, of course.
Say it.
Yeah, so Latino Mennonites is the first book. The second one that's coming out in January is called Apostles of Change. So be on the lookout for that.
I'll be on the lookout for my autographed copies of both of those. Okay, who else?
I'll just quick name my most recent book is called 2 Weeks Every Summer, Fresh Air Children, the Problem of Race in America. It's an exploration of some of the racist patterns involved in the Fresh Air Rural Hosting Program movement. And then the new book I have coming out next year is an exploration of the role of religious resources and social change movements from the civil rights movement to South African anti-apartheid struggle, a host of other sites in which people have brought their religion onto the streets. Super fun project.
Thank you. Dr. Jennifer.
My first book is called The Furnace of Affliction, Prisons and Religion in Antebellum America. And it's about the creation of the very first system of prisons in the United States and the way that religious workers, mostly Quakers, were a part of that process and what they wanted it to be and how it failed. And then just 2 years ago, I published a book called The Gods of Indian Country, which is about the way that Christian missionaries and Kiowa people, how their religious lives were transformed by American expansion into Kiowa territory.
I got to read that book. So I'm soliciting. You may send me an autographed copy and I will gladly accept it. Thank you. Professor Ruth, did you have any books that you would suggest our readers or our participants read?
Sure, I'm not an author, but I have a body of work, 5 CDs that are straight ahead jazz improvisational music with Christian lyrics based on the gospel of Jesus Christ and also justice issues. So that's 5. And then also I contributed 2 books making Are to the Glory of God. It was good. And then also, I forgot, this is terrible. I forgot the name of the other book.
We could show
if I can see it. Yes, it's terrible. He's not watching. But I did a chapter on what does common grace. And I wrote a chapter on it through example using 2 stories of AIDS patients on their deathbeds and common grace. So
we can make sure that it shows up on the Facebook page. Okay. Speaking of the Facebook page, we are Roots of Justice, and we are, if you go to our Facebook page, you can see that there's a place for you to donate. We want to continue doing things like this, hopefully expand a little, but we want to make our online presence more visible. We want to be more visible in the marketplace. We are working at developing tools that we could use as support for. We have an intersectional analysis for intersectional oppression that we are working on. We're working to make all of our products that we would have the capacity to do them remotely because of the area that we're in right now with the COVID. So we're working at that, and we hope in the next month and a half to actually have that online. So I want to remind everybody out there, if you're looking for anti-racism analysis trainings, you want to go with organizations that have been doing this for a long time. There are a lot of new people coming on, and it doesn't mean that they don't have a great analysis, but if they were doing diversity training last week and now they're going to do anti-racism training, there's a good chance that they're not going to give you a good analysis. So Roots of Justice is not the only analysis training out there. However, I do believe that we are one of the best. And we also do a faith-based analysis as well. So I would encourage you all to go to the Roots of Justice page and begin looking for resources so that you can understand what actually needs to change and why. Brenda, are we done?
If you say we're done, we're done.
Oh, okay. Well, I want to thank all of my panelists. This was a really good panel. I want to thank all of y'all, and I hope I can get y'all on another one, and we'll try to make sure that it's a little bit more organized. And it would be a great idea if it could be a little bit longer, so we could have more time to engage the subject matter. Anybody, any final comments?
Thank you, Conrad, for initiating this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lovely to meet you all virtually.
Yes. Stay healthy.